Our next speaker, and the last for this section, and then we'll have a short time for some questions, and then afterwards Paul Chatt-Smith will offer some observations at the end. But our next speaker is Elizabeth Hutchinson from Barnard College, Columbia University. Elizabeth Hutchinson is Associate Professor of North American Art History at Barnard. She earned her BA at Yale University, PhD from Stanford. She's the author of The Indian Craze, Primitivism, Modernism, and Transculturation in American Art, 1890 through 1950. And we're really very pleased to have her here with us this afternoon. Elizabeth.
When I was asked to join this conference today, I was very humbled, and I feel no less humble now at the end of this day. But thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Kay, for sharing some time with me, although I didn't use a lot from our conversation in this talk. And thank you all for sticking around for a stimulating and yet long period of time to sit down. My title comes from a San Francisco Art Institute symposium convened in 1989, the first of 4 annual conferences organized by faculty member Carlos Villa around issues of multiculturalism, education, identity, politics, and the role of the arts in contemporary culture. Participants in these conferences drew on the broad range of people active in California's art worlds at the time, including fine artists, educators, and community organizers, who identified with their Mexican, Latino, Chinese, Vietnamese, Japanese, African American, Jewish, Caribbean, and Native heritages. Indian people were included on several panels of most of these conferences. John Quick-to-See-Smith gave one of the keynotes. This diversity expressed an understanding of the complexity of a goal of multicultural inclusion, as well as an acknowledgement that within communities, artists had diverse modes of practice and goals for their own work. Multiculturalism is a term that has gained a reputation for standing for an uncritical inclusivity that at times approached cynical tokenism in the art world in the 1980s and 1990s. But returning to the work of artists, curators, and curators of color at the beginning of the 1990s reveals that they had an ambitious, critical agenda and clear sense of the obstacles in their way. The keynote speaker at the first symposium, Sources of a Distinct Majority, Agenda for the 1990s, my Columbia colleague Kelly Jones, shown here, exemplifies this. She was at the time curator at the Jamaica Arts Center in Queens, having already worked at the Studio Museum in Harlem and as an independent curator. Her talk was tasked with responding to the questions, where are we? What are we celebrating? What are the issues that the art and artists of color face in the 1990s? According to Jones, there was much to celebrate. Among other things, she lauded an expansion of the imagination of an art world that allowed a critical engagement with artists from a wide range of backgrounds, working with an equally wide range of mediums, styles, and subjects. From her keynote, quote, "Suddenly, it's all right for Anselm Kiefer to make paintings that deal with Germany's painful history, but more importantly, perhaps, it is all right for Martin Puryear, an African-American sculptor, to make beautiful, monumental sculptures that are at once poetic, elusive, and formally complex." But if Jones found much to celebrate, she also found much to be concerned about. In particular, she pointed out the fact that the interest in non-dominant traditions that had emerged in the 1970s had led to a wave of appropriation of what she called third world cultures by white artists, while critics dismissed artists of color whose work was not other enough. In the face of this, she advocated a truly multicultural agenda that was not separate and exclusionary, but invited alliance building between communities and recognizing the diverse needs and agendas within communities. I want to say right up front here that my scholarly research and writing is not about this period. I'm speaking about multiculturalism in this time period because I was asked to, but my patch of art history is much earlier, and I do wonder how this talk might go if, say, Lowry Sims was on the stage sharing her perspective on this period with you. But when I agreed to do this talk, I explained that I could only speak about the 1990s as someone who spent a decade working in and observing the art world at that time. In writing this paper, I've recalled my own excitement my own excitement about the increased interest in building multiple voices into cultural discussions at that time. Living in Berlin in 1991, for example, I attended a standing room only reading by Alice Walker at the America House. For me, it was exciting but not surprising to see the United States celebrating a living female artist of color in this international venue. In the preceding 2 years, I had witnessed what seemed like a breathtaking expansion of the art world with the spread of blockbuster art exhibitions that brought previously marginalized artworks inside the museum walls and took politicized art into the streets. This is a snapshot of some of the works I encountered in museums, in art history classes, and in Soho of the time. And perhaps some of you are not my peers, so I will point out that we see the monumental, if flawed, Chicano art resistance and affirmation exhibition, the work of the Guerrilla Girls, and the politicized fight against homophobia on the part of the collective Grand Fury, among other things. And this was also a period of tremendous emergence of African American photographers who are represented here by Carrie Mae Weems' quite pointed critique of stereotypes in the day. In 1991, when I heard the Alice Walker talk, Kay WalkingStick was implicated in this expansion of the art world. She was included in group exhibitions that attempted to offer the kinds of bridges between diverse communities that Jones and Villa aspired to, such as those referred to in this slide, the Decade Show, and an exhibition of the work of the students of Black printmaker Robert Blackburn, who was noted for the inclusivity of his workshop. The Decade Show, subtitled Frameworks of Identity in the 1980s, exemplified the expansive definition of multiculturalism espoused by Jones and Villa. As the curators explained, the exhibition was issue-oriented, but not prescriptive about the form or style used to raise an issue, explaining that, quote, identity is a hybrid and fluid notion that reflects the diversity of American society, and that works taking a wide range of forms that might, quote, be seen as material evidence of alternative viewpoints. The 94 artists involved in the Decade Show were dispersed among 3 venues: the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, the Studio Museum of Harlem, and the New Museum, each of which grouped work around specific themes. WalkingStick's paintings were on display at the New Museum, which was given over to the themes of myth, spirituality, nature, and discourse media. Imagine the slashes between these words. It was very 90s writing. Several other artists of color were shown in this venue, but lest I give the impression that all Native artists were seen as operating under the rubric of myth, that being one of the themes I just mentioned, it's useful to state that Richard Ray Whitman's work was displayed at the Hispanic Museum, where the themes of biography, autobiography, and sexuality, gender were the dominant ones, and Huck Ivey, Edgar Hepburn, G. Peter Jemison, James Luna, and another Jean Quick-to-See Smith work were installed at the Studio Museum under the themes of social practices, cultural criticism, and history, memory, artifact. Though WalkingStick's work at the Decade Show was not specifically political, many of the group exhibitions in which she showed in the early 1990s were specifically organized in response to the national celebration of the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival in America, as has been discussed already. And for these shows, she made work with legible political content. Tears, shown in the Submaloc show, Columbus Waltz, curated by Jean Quick-to-See Smith, and The Wizard Speaks, The Cavalry Listens, December 29, 1890, included in For the Seventh Generation, Native American artists counter the quincentenary, organized by Phil Young, just mentioned in Jolene's talk, in 1992, give a pointed illustration of WalkingStick's response to this celebration, as Margaret Archuleta has discussed in the catalog for this exhibition. And you can see both of these works upstairs in the show. Looking at WalkingStick's less overtly political work exposes some of the contradictions embedded within the multiculturalism of the 1990s. On the one hand, curators were fighting for an inclusiveness that allowed artists to work with the styles and materials that made sense to them, regardless of whether they offered a direct connection to the artist's identity. At the same time, they suggested that those same works would express the, quote, alternative viewpoint of the maker based on his or her identity. In her 1994 essay on WalkingStick, Erin Valentino diagnosed this art world problem, arguing that, quote, multiculturalist interrogations of identity politics often reify the margin and reproduce institutional estrangement from marginalized artists, separating margin and center, political utility, and aesthetic pleasure. Kelly Jones attempted to avoid these problems by taking artist work on its own terms. Her article on WalkingStick for the Village Voice Art Special in the spring of 1989 focuses on form and technique, as might be deemed appropriate for an artist working in a modernist idiom, and has been modeled by many of the scholars presenting today. Jones describes the diptychs WalkingStick was making at that time in detail, bringing them to life. Quote, the entire work is done on canvas, but the landscape portion is usually unstretched and painted in acrylic with the artist's hands, while the abstract section receives layers of oil and wax that are scratched and cut into. Later, she compares WalkingStick's work to art that might be more familiar to voice readership, explaining that it, quote, shares the lyrical abstraction and love of surface of her contemporary Elizabeth Murray and the fascination with romantic landscape of Jennifer Bartlett and April Gornick. But in this same short piece, Jones loses patience with her assignment, writing, how do you begin to talk about artists of color who could use more exposure when they all could? And going on to think about her task, about the fact that her task was not just to highlight good work, but also to, quote, address issues of media, content, gender, and race. Jones lists many, many of the names of artists she couldn't profile in a meaningful way in this venue. A year later, Lucy Lepard published her book Mixed Blessings, New Art in a Multicultural America, which attempted to extend a huge number of deserving artists the same coverage through a paragraph discussion of each and a single reproduction of their work. WalkingStick is one of those included. Lepard quotes her in a section devoted to the interrogation of the primitivism inherent in critical and curatorial practice at that time that created an essentializing link between the appearance of an artist's work and her or his race, ethnicity, and indigeneity. But she also included a quotation from Paula Gunn Allen's book on Native American spirituality, criticized by many for its universalizing and mythification of indigeneity, fueling at the time a kind of New Age fascination, right next to the reproduction of WalkingStick's diptych. As I was thinking through this talk, I had a flash of memory of this book of short stories purchased in Berlin just after seeing Alice Walker. It's titled Freu dich nicht zu früh, Don't Celebrate Too Soon. What are we celebrating, indeed? WalkingStick understood the compromised situation of American multiculturalism, even as she accepted the invitations to show her work under its auspices. As she wrote in her editor's statement for the 1992 issue of Art Journal called Recent Native American Art, a publication that has had an incredible impact on the teaching of Native American art history, quote, troubling thoughts have arisen in my mind concerning the many shows, panels, and seminars on ethnicity with which I have been involved. Often, it seems that these exhibitions are a way to garner government support or to entertain the general public with the exotic or the nostalgic. I have much more respect for exhibition and panel organizers when there are minority artists in all of their shows and on all of their panels. In addition, organizers very often expect a few minority artists to represent an entire group of people politically, ideologically, and culturally. Yet nobody expects that of Frank Stella or Barbara Kruger. On the screen is a work from the Talking Leaves series of the 1990s in which WalkingStick recorded some of her experiences of insensitive remarks by others about her identity. This one is inscribed in both Cherokee and English, enough. As WalkingStick's words that I just quoted illustrate, many of the people of color who participated in multicultural projects in the art world did not turn a blind eye to their contradictions, but instead used the platforms they were given to continue to press for change. These two exhibition catalogs, produced for Soho galleries that touted their inclusion of artists marginalized in other venues, pulled no punches. Kelly Jones' exhibition From the Artist File pointed out that the file, an archive created to give access to information about little-known artists for curators, critics, and art professionals, had only 6% artists included out of the 2,500 who self-identified as members of, quote, minority groups. Are these artists just among those that, as the white critic Kay Larson accused in 1985, Jones wrote, simply cannot muster the strength to supply the file with proper documentation? Or are other factors involved in their exclusion? And if so, are these factors remediable? One of the factors consistently raised by artists, curators, and critics of color in the 1990s was the need to continue and expand funding to support the implementation of the new multicultural agenda. At the time, public funding for the arts had been an American institution for over a quarter century. A model was set by Governor Nelson Rockefeller's New York State Council for the Arts, established in 1960. The National Endowment of the Arts was founded 5 years later, following that pattern in 1965. Both organizations, in addition to New York City's Office of Cultural Affairs, were essential for the establishment and sustenance of community-based art centers, such as El Museo del Barrio and the Studio Museum of Harlem, shown here, as well as the American Indian Community House Gallery. In addition to galleries dedicated to recording, celebrating, and inspiring the creative work of specific communities, public funding was a vital lifeline to organizations such as Artist Space. The location of We the People, an exhibition of contemporary Native art curated by Jimmy Durham in 1987, which included Kay's work, and consistently showed the work of artists of color, though, as Jones points out, perhaps not often enough or in the most inclusive way. Jones's San Francisco keynote bore witness to the fact that public funding was not equitably distributed, however. As she wrote, large mainstream institutions and galleries, quote, are often line items in city budgets, receive tax benefits, and use public land, yet they are virtually unaccountable in terms of the equal opportunity multicultural agenda that is required of most city contractors. Neither the program, staff, nor the boards of trustees of these institutions are multicultural. And it is important to understand that what funding did find its way to arts organizations with a clear commitment to working with marginalized communities often came from separate, smaller funding streams specifically earmarked for this purpose. In the late 1960s, NISCA began funneling some applications to a newly established ghetto arts program, which was run by officials who prioritized allaying social unrest over the search for the most talented and innovative artists. Again, following NISCA's lead, the NEA soon created the Expansion Arts Program in 1970. While guaranteeing some funds for multicultural initiatives, this strategy demonstrated that the flawed philosophy of separate but equal had entered the art world. The cutbacks and changes in public funding that, page 12 would be good. Criticism from Jones and others caused the NEA to examine how it put together, actually I'll go back to the last one for just a second because that's way too distracting, to examine how it put together the panels who assessed grant applications, questioning the connection between their makeup and the fact that the overwhelming majority of funds went to white male artists and well-established institutions. Unfortunately, this insight occurred in 1990, just as the culture wars erupted over the use of public funds for artworks deemed controversial by Senator Jesse Helms and several conservative political groups. Time does not permit me to rehearse the events surrounding the discussion of works by artists Robert Mapplethorpe, Andres Serrano, Karen Finley, and others that occurred, but I'm showing these two slides to help illustrate that moment and help underline the fact that while many of those public debates centered on discussions of sexuality and Christianity, participants saw expressions of race and ethnicity as part of what was being censored. I recall a roundtable here at the Smithsonian in which a Latina critic explained Serrano's aesthetic vision manifest in the famous Piss Christ on the left from a Hispanic point of view. And on the right, if you read the Guerrilla Girls poster, you can see that they understood that Helms and his allies were as frightened of black people as they were of homosexuals. the culture wars resulted in cutbacks and changes in public funding that did a great deal to slow down the implementation of a new multicultural agenda. What are we celebrating? For many of us working in Native studies, one of the major flaws of multiculturalism is its tendency to treat indigeneity as an ethnicity, equating it with other hyphenated American identities, rather than recognizing the distinctive relationship between members of sovereign Native nations to the United States. But in revisiting the actual texts from the 1990s, I'm struck less by the ignorance of the writers of the time than by their wisdom in finding ways to make strategic connections between groups with diverse experiences of state violence. Jones, raised close to the intellectual center of the Black Power movement, identifies her constituencies as third world peoples and states that the cultural work of the present stemmed from deep roots, tracing back to the beginnings of settler colonialism in the Americas. Quote, "The progress we have seen since the 70s could not have happened unless there had been some kind of resistance, some kind of movement happening in this country over the last 500 years. Jimmy Durham and others linked disempowerment within the United States to other nations' colonial and imperial acts in Africa and the Middle East. And even when not specifically mentioning the link between artistic self-expression and nationalist politics, participants in discussions about multiculturalism and art raised questions of self-determination that helped shape some of those later discussions. What is at stake in Judith Wilson's articulation of the, quote, boldly eclectic spirit of postmodernist intellectual life? Or Kelly Jones' assertion that, quote, plurality reflects the acceptance of the legitimacy, diversity, and variety of the world picture, if not expressions of a kind of sovereignty, not indigenous sovereignty, but perhaps a cousin. What are we celebrating? Over the coffee last week, Kelly and I discussed the failures and short-sightedness of 1990s multiculturalism, and also some of its legacies. To each of us, the most profound aspect of this effort is that curators, artists, and critics came together to advance each other's work. In 1989, Jones celebrated, quote, growing numbers of people of color who have made a commitment to being our artists, our voices and our minds, our teachers, our organizers, and our administrators. Even more profound is the fact that so many of these people, some of whom are shown here, some of whom have spoken or are being honored today, are still serving as leaders of a principled, critical, and inclusive discussion of the arts in America and beyond. From this perspective, our watchword might not be don't celebrate too soon, but celebrate often. Celebrate each opportunity for artists of color and indigenous artists to exhibit work in any context, to make connections across any divide, to reach audiences, inspire young artists, contribute to a growing market for their work, for the work of other artists whose identity may have marginalized their visibility or narrowed the terms in which their work was seen. In abdicating this practice, I do not mean to downplay being critical or learning from the past. Rather, I want to separate the idea of celebration from a sense that there is a victory, a mission accomplished, and instead think of celebration as an important strategy for survival and recommitment. In this, I'm reminded of a creation story that I've recently learned from Northwest Alaska. And in sharing it, I'm not intending to invoke some kind of universal indigenous value system, but rather that would apply specifically to WalkingStick, but rather to reflect on its wisdom and consider its application in other contexts for all of us. In this Inupiat story, the Eagle Mother gave people dancing. As Elder Ikayuak explains it, in wintertime, when subsistence activities trailed off, the people grew lonely. The Eagle Mother recognized that humankind is so lonely because they do not have the gift of festivity. They need to learn how to sing and dance in order to survive. Mankind will not survive without feeling joy. When I see Kay WalkingStick's dancing pictures, I think celebration. Across the incredibly long span of her career, WalkingStick has returned again and again to the theme of bodies in motion, coming together with a sense of intimacy and sometimes abandon. These works give me the sense that though she has been clear-eyed about the realities that shaped her opportunities as an artist throughout her career, she is a person who understands the importance of celebration, and I'm delighted to participate in this celebration of her today. Thank you.